record to this computer. There we go. All right, so hello and welcome everyone. We were talking a little bit about submission stuff for those who can't join us right now and are listening in through the recording. The question was about how are we going to submit the reading responses, and you're supposed to be writing it as kind of a journal, about 100 words a week on the readings, and you'll submit those things on Learn when they are due right around midterms and right around finals. There'll be two separate submissions. But basically, it's just a reading journal, so you're supposed to be keeping a journal of this stuff. And, these readings do feed into it, and especially those class discussions. We'll be having plenty more of those like we did last time. Hello, King. My cat will sometimes interrupt because that is what cats do. His name is King Richard I, by the way. Say hello. Say hello. Come here. This is King. He just really wants to look outside. There you go. All right. Today though, last time we had talked about the Gilded Age, and this time we're going to be covering a lot of stuff that happened during the Gilded Age, but also a lot of stuff that this class is structured more thematically than chronologically, though I try to keep it a little bit chronological. Because today, let me turn on screen share. We're going to be talking about immigration, and specifically the history of immigration in the United States. Remember that we had a discussion last time at the beginning to talk about how periodization is weird. Well, that was kind of leading towards this, that don't expect to be able to follow just one step after the other throughout this class. We're trying to try to think thematically. And when I say thematically, I mean, what is the theme of the lecture? It's pretty obvious right there. But what does that theme mean? How does this history feed into the present? What is the significance of this history? So that's what we're talking about when I say thematic history. And I hope you guys can also see that this is kind of showing you that there are many ways of viewing history. I'm sure some of you have already had history classes before, but there are many ways of viewing history, and hopefully this shows that. So, immigration, especially after the war, that's what postbellum means. Antebellum means before the war, and postbellum means after. And the war being referred to here is the Civil War, the worst war in American history. So that's typically in historical parlance, that's what people mean when they say the antebellum South. I think I already used that word today. is that the antebellum South is pre-Civil War. You hear that word a lot when we're talking about slavery because, well, postbellum South, there is no slavery. But in the North, especially, considering the growth of industry and everything during the Gilded Age, there was a need for labor. And a lot of that labor, while we had talked about a little bit last time with the move from agriculture to urbanization, the a lot of that labor force wasn't just fueled by natives of America. Um, native, by the way, refers to where you're born, so the words can be a bit weird when you're using it historically, since that has a different meaning outside of the history profession. Um, but we're talking nativity as in birthplace, and natives of America, you know, didn't were actually a a plurality of labor throughout this period, but often were made up of immigrants, people who were born elsewhere, foreigners. And of course, they had to immigrate. And this process of immigration has deep roots, but especially after the war, you can come on. There we go. You can see a huge jump up. So this is the war right here. And oh, nope, that's not the war. That's the war. That's 1960. So this is a chart that shows all the way to basically present. It's a few years off, but but notice that that's total amount of immigrants. This is the immigrants as a percentage of U.S. population. So we actually haven't hit the amount of immigration that was present after the Civil War. Notice this is 2017. It's actually gone down since 2017. But notice how high that is compared to even today when we have this massive spike after 1964. 1964, we'll get to why that is, but that's purely because of a change in immigration law. And this period right here, for a good chunk of it, was basically completely unregulated. Immigration was basically completely open up until 1882, when Chinese immigration was severely curtailed, and then 1924, when a quota law was instituted. Oh, that's 24. There's stuff that predates it. For instance, the Border Patrol kind of dates back to 1902, depending on how you want to define it. Because back then it was called the Chinese Border Patrol. But you can see this is the period of industrialization and why and how immigration somewhat responded to it. So there were many reasons for immigration. It was not just the pull of industry, but also the pull of what America offered. Because I mean, after all, that symbol, of liberty there, the Statue of Liberty, is supposed to symbolize something, right? And a lot of people who were immigrating would pass that as they were coming in. And it's supposed to be the poem on it is I hold my lamp besides the gate. It's talking about the gateway to freedom. So that was a huge thing, was this promise of America. And so especially after 1862, when the Lincoln administration passed the Homestead Act, anyone could immigrate west, and as long as they spent 2 years on that particular area of land, they would be able to keep it. That was the only caveat, and it gave them 160 acres. Now, the reason why it's 160 acres is if you actually look at maps of the United States, especially more rural areas, you'll see kind of a grid pattern everywhere. And it's this oddly uniform grid pattern of 160 acres for each plot. It's kind of rectangular. And it spreads from Ohio outwards. You can look on Google Maps right now and see that pattern all the way across the United States. And the reason why it starts in Ohio was the Northwest Land Ordinance in 1789. I mean 1787, re-upped in 1789 with the passage of the Constitution, and that it set up a way of dividing land, and we have kept it so uniform that it applies all the way from Ohio to California. Um, Heck, even up in Alaska, you can find this pattern, even though it's not exactly the same offset, since there's no continuous land there. Um, the but Immigrants would often immigrate specifically to take advantage of this, and the Homestead Act was quickly modified throughout its history. Um, there was For instance, there was during Reconstruction, there was that Southern Homestead Act, which didn't actually give didn't give as many acres as 160. I think it gave 80 in the South. But it was to break up plantations and give it to give it to former slaves. That whole 40 acres and a mule thing. Of course, the problem there being is that with all the terrorism going on in the South through things like the KKK, that didn't exactly go through, and so the Southern Homestead Act is kind of seen as a failure. Um, but you also had the Timber Act of 1873, which meant that people could purchase adjoining acreage of up to 320 acres, um, so long as it was regulated for timbering um, or for ranching. Basically, if you could prove that you had some sort of way of using the land, you could buy more. Um, and there was the Oklahoma land rushes of 1889 through 93. These were essentially, and we will get to the Western Indian Wars, but in Oklahoma before 1889, it was known as Indian Territory, and they broke up a bunch of Indian land in order to to basically sell it off. And essentially, they had everybody line up on the eastern boundary and just rush in to claim all of this land. They literally just told everybody to run. They did this in several rushes throughout the years, and um, you had people who were trying to go in early, who were called Sooners, and then there were people who were of the rushers, and I'm forgetting the word for that. It is still what people call Oklahoma University today. Whatever their symbol is, it's that. um, the Then there was the Kincaid Act of 1904, because people realized that 160 acres weren't really adequate for farming in certain areas of arid land, such as New Mexico, um, and Arizona, or even out on the Great Plains. So basically, any place that was considered too arid was was uh, was expanded. And the first expansion with this Kincaid Act happened in Nebraska, where they got 640 acres. Um, soon that was applied. Soon the 320 acres thing was applied to the in 1909 with the Enlarged Homestead Act. Um, and then there was several other ones. There's the Stock Raising Act of 1916, which was 640 acres for any kind of stock raising and all that. And these kinds of plots, these kinds of um, additions continued all the way into the 1930s, when in 1933 there was the Subsistence Act, basically people creating homesteads for subsistence only. Um, but it was generally a smaller plot than 160 acres. And then there was this even smaller plots called jackrabbits starting in 1938, which allowed people to take 5 acres for basically any purpose whatsoever. That's how, if you ever travel through the desert on like the highway and you see, like a gas station that's in the middle of nowhere, it was probably homesteaded by via claiming a jackrabbit and a jackrabbit plot, so that basically they could have gas stations in the middle of nowhere. So that, as if you've ever traveled long distances, you know that sometimes you start running low on gas, and if you're in the middle of the desert, that's pretty worrying. So you can see all of this was designed for helping America grow industrially, but it also gave an impetus for people to immigrate. Um, and in fact, the end of these Homestead Acts didn't actually end until 1976, or in Alaska, 1986. Um, so, you know, probably within most of your parents' lifetime, the Homestead Act was still active, um, though most of the lands had already been given out. Um, and this was obviously to help with that whole second industrial revolution. Um, and since there was that um, second industrial revolution happening, which we talked in the last lecture about, you know, there was obviously jobs for immigrants to take up. Um, Even during the depressions of 1873 and 1894, um, these depressions were um, kind of more like recessions today. Like how some of you may remember the Great Recession of 2008, where unemployment was really high, but it wasn't so bad that it was crippling the economy altogether. That's kind of the situation that these were in. Well, I mean, they were substantially worse, but but in a time um, the when your boss could fire you for whatever reason, um, that was a bit different. But there were more jobs here than anywhere else. Remember, we had talked about how a third of the world's industrial output was being done by the United States by the turn of the century. And so there was a substantial labor market for that. Um, and that's why the US was seen as a land of opportunity. You had the ability uh, to get land, and you also had the ability to possibly work in an industry. But also there were those are the pulls for immigration, but there were also pushes. Um, these immigration kind of came in waves, especially from particular regions. So, for instance, in the 1840s, you had the Irish potato famine. So you had this huge immigration wave from Ireland. From the 1850s to 60s, the reason why there were so many Chinese immigrants was because people were immigrating to take refuge in the United States away from the Taiping Rebellion that was happening in China, one of the bloodiest wars in history, and damn near genocidal. Then there were the wars of national unification throughout the 1860s and 70s, especially in 1871, Germany became a thing. Before 1871, there was no such place as Germany. Same thing with Italy. Italy unified that very same year. Kind of different tracks. The reason why Germany unified was because of taking territory more and more and more until they unified during the Franco-Prussian War of 1869 through 71. But the people trying to immigrate away from those unifications, for instance, well, the people trying to immigrate away from those unifications gave a reason for more people from Central Europe to move in from Germany and Italy. That's why there was a huge influx of German immigrants at the time. Um, for instance, I have a great grandfather who moved from Alsace-Lorraine, from the Alsace-Lorraine region, because that's the final region to be taken by the Prussians to unify Germany. Um, and he actually became one of the founders of Orange County, California. Um, so you know, a lot of people in the U.S. have their origins because of these immigrations away from violent events elsewhere. Um, uh, in the 1880s, you saw an influx of Central Europeans as places like Poland and that became more and more repressed by Prussian and Russian authorities, by German and Russian authorities. And then in the around the turn of the century, there was a huge influx of people from the Balkans because of the Balkan Wars, which eventually led to World War One. And during that period, there was, of course, the Mexican Revolution in the 19 teens, throughout the 19 teens, starting in 1900. I mean 1910. And people trying to immigrate away from that. So you could see like this immigration, while having a pull, that promise of land and prosperity, there was also the need to take refuge from violent events abroad. So this push factor led to why there was so much immigration in this period. But of course, there was a reaction to that by natives. There's this term that you'll hear often when talking about U.S. history and U.S. politics, is this term nativism. Now, nativism is referring to basically being anti-foreigner. But in this period, it was worse than just being anti-immigration. It was literally anti-foreigner. Some folks literally wanted to push, as this political cartoon insinuates, is to push them back into the sea, the rats. They're showing rats fleeing a ship because all this violence is happening elsewhere, and people are afraid that they're going to bring it here. And realize this cartoon is from 1898, 96 actually, or 97, somewhere in there. And you could see down here that they're talking about anarchists and socialists and the mafia, even an Italian flag around the sky with the mafia thing on it, all of them holding daggers of murder and assassination. So this kind of rhetoric, you might remember the Trump administration engaging in a lot of this kind of rhetoric, but it's nothing new. It's very old. In fact, that was a lot of the commentary when Trump was getting elected in 2016, was how much it resembled the xenophobia of earlier eras. And in fact, the first president to use the term America first would be Woodrow Wilson, who was very much a nativist. Well, unless the people immigrating were British, then he was a bit of an Anglophone. So, sorry, I haven't seen the chats over there. I have to have it on another screen. And Chase asked, did the immigrants get mostly taken advantage of in terms of labor? Well, in this period of time, it's weird to say taken advantage of, because just labor in general was taken advantage of. Remember, we had talked about the gross wealth disparity during the Gilded Age? Well, that applies just as much to immigrants. Now, when you're talking about racially alienated folks like Chinese people, especially Chinese people weren't called laborers, they were called coolies because apparently aren't capable of labor like white men. Um, and the uh, the coolies were put under a system called. In fact, I think we will be talking a little bit about that. No, we won't. Okay. Um, I thought we would, but there was a system, especially in the West, called padrones, and padrones were basically they would pay for your immigration, and then you had to work within that company for X amount of years. It was almost indentured servitude, even though you would be paid, unlike indentured servitude. Um, but it's essentially the same system, but with pay. So it was employment, but you were contractually obligated to work for that company. Um, and that could get really abusive really quick. Plus, the railroads and that were perfectly fine with just paying people with paying people not even enough to live, um, because they would provide food themselves and that during the work. But as soon as the work was done, well, all the coolies get thrown to the wayside, and we'll get to how bad that really got. Um, so I hope that answers your question. Um, but before people could react to things like Chinese immigration and that at the national level, there was significant local, state and local laws before this. Um, back when I was talking about this and I said, there were no immigration laws. Well, I was kind of lying. There were absolutely immigration laws, just not on the national level. Um, so, for instance, the first real major anti-immigration law was in Massachusetts in 1794. So this is how deeply rooted nativism is. Um, and the Anti-Pauper Act, basically, anti-pauper, like pauper means like poor person, basically. Um, hold on a second, King. No. My cat was trying to bite something he's not supposed to be biting. um, but the paupers are basically poor people, especially homeless poor people. And if a pauper was found to be to be to be an immigrant, they could be deported. Basically, Massachusetts would deport them, not the federal government. Um, so there was that kind of stuff. There were head taxes, which is essentially a tax on anybody trying to enter that state who is a foreigner. And so they like force people to go into a port, and um now normally the actual ship owner had to pay the head tax, but how do you think the ship owner was going to pay it? um he wouldn't let immigrants onto the ship if he couldn't pay for it, and so that probably was worked into their fees for transportation. Um, and there was also significant laws against Haitian refugees after the Haitian Revolution. Um, this had a lot to do with slavery in that at the time, but it also had this fear of socialism and anarchism coming from the dark people. Um, read that as you will. Um, and so they would try to limit immigration from refugees from the Haitian Revolution, even though a lot of Haitian refugees were actually like white French people who were trying to escape the massacres there, because there were actually a series of massacres in Haiti, basically a genocide. Um, but people were trying to stop that immigration because they were afraid that that would lead to to slave revolts in the United States, and arguably it did, especially in 1810, 1811, something around there, in on the German coast of just north of New Orleans. Was a huge slave revolt, basically the biggest one in American history until the Civil War. Um, well, that was more of a pro-slavery revolt. And then throughout the long before the 1850s, actually, but the Know Nothings in the 1850s, which was a basically an anti-immigration society, a secret society, and they would have like secret handshakes and whatnot. And then they'd also like have big old riots in New York and that against immigrants, killing a few in the process, especially if they were Catholic. These were often called Orange riots because at the time, newspapers would often blame the Irish immigrants for this, even though uh, it was probably, I mean, well, orange refers to Protestant and green refers to Catholic. If you look at the Irish flag today, it has green, white, and orange stripes, and that's supposed to be the unification between Protestant and Catholic. Um, so the Orange riots were specifically against Catholics, especially Irish people. And these folks became known as Know Nothings because they were a secret society, and you'd ask them about like what they were doing, and they say, "I know nothing." And they in fact became a political party known as the Native American Party. Native American, and remember it has a different meaning here. Native American is referring to native people who are native to America. Um, and the Native American Party, or sometimes just the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, um, actually ended up having a former president running for it, and so it became a fairly popular third party for a little bit in there. Um, and yet they had this very violent side. Orange riots would continue all the way into the 1880s in New York. So this is all happening on the local level. Um, and finally, in the 1880s, well, late 1870s, early 1880s, New York and Massachusetts came together to create a to um, to basically write proposals for immigration laws. Um, but California beat them to it because in California they were dealing with Chinese immigration. And remember, we've already talked a little bit um, about how Chinese immigration was seen as alien. And well, I mean, everything's technically alien, but that like these people did not want um, Chinese people to become Americans, to naturalize into citizenship. For instance, in 1850, the freshly made state of California actually put an impetus against um, what's called the Foreign Miners Act, and essentially anybody who was mining and a foreigner had to pay a tax. And so it necessarily put a an impetus against foreigners, whereas Americans didn't have to pay that tax because, well, they're Americans. But you can already see from the get-go there is anti-Chinese sentiment, and especially throughout the gold rush and other mineral rushes in California, um, there would be continuously disproportionate enforcement of these laws. Because it's really easy to see that a Chinese person is probably a foreigner, as opposed to a as opposed to just a dude from Scotland. Um, Even though you could probably hear it in his voice. Um, but also, you have to think these laws were disproportionately enforced, not just because of the ease at which you could disproportionately enforce them, but also the desire to disproportionately enforce them. Um, there was very much a want to fight Chinese influence, um, which led to the movement in California called the Chinese Must Go movement. And essentially, people would put signs in their windows, and towns would even declare that Chinese people were not allowed in town and stuff like that, and they'd put Chinese people into ghettos, um, and um, you also have to remember that the opium trade was particularly high, so they'd have like drug dens and that, and so people saw Chinese people as bringing their drugs, um, and that kind of stuff. Um, and it really built into this huge amount of hatred, to the point that there were several race riots, or probably better termed race massacres, where a Chinese person might cross a boundary that they weren't supposed to go into, or something along those lines, and a bunch of white people get really angry about it and just start massacring Chinese people. This got particularly bad in San Francisco, where they had several of these mounting to, and throughout. Actually, the worst one was in Idaho, um, but and that one had what, 85 dead. Um, so literally hundreds of people are of Chinese people are being killed in these uh, Chinese race riots, as part of this Chinese must go movement. So it's not just segregation, where they're like putting them in ghettos and saying that Chinese are not allowed to use these businesses and whatnot. It's also very much enforced through violence. We'll see the same thing with Jim Crow in the South. Um, but this leads to legislation. First came the Page Act, named after Senator Page, a California senator, which limited the types of immigrants who could come from China. It came alongside with a treaty um, with the Qing government in China, Qing being the dynasty, um, and this basically said that you know uh, Chinese prostitutes were not allowed. Anybody who was not a productive, who was deemed unproductive, kind of a revival of that whole Massachusetts Anti-Pauper Act, if you remember that. And you know, basically, even minors weren't allowed to immigrate. They had to basically be like sworn to be house workers, domestic workers like cooks and that, or um, railroad workers. So if you think about how like there's that kind of Western trope where Chinese people might be a domestic worker, like a cook or a coolie on the railroad. Well, that's actually by law. That was created by law. In fact, a lot of our kind of tropes about these kind of racial tropes. For instance, the whole thing of like Asians are smart people because that's just their culture. Well, it's partially because um, law made it so that only highly educated Asians were allowed to immigrate. throughout from the 1920s all the way to the 1960s. That trope isn't that isn't some sort of thing natural to a particular race. There's no such thing as that. But that's how we get those tropes, is by these regulations after decades of their enforcement. And it got worse from the Page Act. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically said no more Chinese immigration whatsoever. And that was the law of the land. And Chinese exclusion would actually remain all the way until 1964. Though it would be changed in 1924, which we'll get to. But that was kind of the only thing. But remember, we talked about all those different waves of immigration throughout the period. Well, Americans, especially natives, were concerned about these other kinds of immigration. So in 1907, Congress put together the Dillingham Commission, otherwise known as the United States Immigration Commission, led by Congressman Dillingham, which was formed to study the consequences of immigration, especially this huge influx of immigration. And they actually recommended several laws that would take about a decade to be implemented. But this was where you could see the U.S. starting to turn towards more exclusionary stuff. So it started off with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but by the 1920s, it was very much exclusionary of any kind of immigrants other than white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, otherwise known as WASPs. And in 1917, was the passage of the Literacy Act, which basically said that you couldn't cross the border without having a literacy test. And in fact, a year later, well, we'll get to that. There was actually a requirement for IDs to make sure that you had taken this literacy test. Basically forcing folks who were immigrating from Mexico, remember there was the Mexican Revolution at this point, to be fluent in English, which is a high impetus from a high bar to leap over when they're coming from a Spanish-speaking country. There is no such thing as an American language, nor an official language on the federal level. Some states have passed it, though it's actually by most legal scholars, most constitutional scholars would say that is unconstitutional. It just hasn't been tried at the Supreme Court yet, probably because no one's willing to enforce it. But at this point, there was absolutely no belief in English is the language of America. In fact, foreign language presses were common throughout especially throughout the West. For instance, here you'd have a lot of presses that would print duolingually, and in fact, the law, the Constitution of New Mexico, when it was signed in 1912, required that laws be published both in English and Spanish. So you can have a wide variety of differences from the states, but generally there was no law requiring English proficiency until the Literacy Act of 1917. So this led to what is called the quota system. In response to World War I, there was an emergency quota put on immigration, basically saying, if you're coming, and this was under what's called the Enemy Aliens Act, which basically said that there was, if you're coming from Germany, we're at war with Germany, you don't get to you don't get to immigrate. And that was re-upped with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. Um, where it said like a certain amount of people from each country could immigrate um, according to World War One numbers, and this was really codified with the Immigration Act of 1924. Now, the Immigration Act of 24 specifically stated that um, a certain that a certain percentage of immigrants who had immigrated from the previous like 1910, I think was the census they used, um, that immigrants from countries from 1910 levels had a certain percentage. So notice that that basically eliminates um, Mexican immigration, because the large wave of Mexican immigration happened during the 19 teens. Um, but there's also, refugees from World War One and that kind of stuff, and it put a cap according to immigration from countries in 1910, and this would remain the cap all the way until 1965. Um, and so that's what this cartoon is showing over here, is that they have this huge amount of European immigration, but then they put a cap on it, and um, that's the quota. So a certain amount of people from each country were allowed to come in under the quota system. Hold on a second. The and this was taking place right around the Mexican Revolution. Um, though the revolution itself ended in 1920, there was still a huge amount of Mexican immigration. Um, and so Mexican immigration tends to kind of um, from this point onward tends to come in waves, to ebb and flow. That it was flowing during the 1920s, because agriculture needed workers, and so they kept the quota high. But then during the New Deal, during the Great Depression, um, the government wanted it to ebb away, and so there were mass deportations during the New Deal, specifically so that Mexican immigrants couldn't compete for agricultural jobs during the worst jobs crisis in American history. During World War II, there was the Bracero program, which essentially gave migrant workers a path to citizenship, and also paid for their immigration in that, partially because, well, a bunch of agricultural workers were now going off to fight World War II. And this program actually continued all the way until the end of the quota system, but it really started having pushback in the 1950s, because people were afraid of Mexican communists, and so the government engaged in what it called, and this is actually what the government called it, Operation Wetback in 1954, which was basically a mass deportation program. But it was actually more about trying to encourage them to go elsewhere, by offering like financial incentives and that, um, or to also deport who could be traced to any kind of communist leanings. Um, so you can see there's this kind of ebb and flow within the quota system. But finally, as part of the whole civil rights movement, in 1965, the Hart-Celler Act eliminated the quota system and gave us the system that we have today. Now, it's still technically a quota, but it's more about the size of the country they're immigrating from rather than um, previous status of immigration from that nation before 1910. Um, so while it's still a quota, as in like there's only so many Mexicans who are allowed to immigrate into the United States, um, it's much more about the size of that country rather than a racist system trying to eliminate these foreigners. Probably shouldn't say racist, more like xenophobic. Um, Now, you could definitely argue that our system is still xenophobic, but it also gives the government the ability to raise those quotas or lower those quotas. It's not based on previous status of immigration. It's just they can raise it and lower it as they see fit. Um, so it's considered a much more equal system. Um, but especially now that we're talking about Mexican immigration, um, let's spend how much time do we have? All right, cool. Still have 20 minutes. Um, let's talk about uh, you can tell I wrote this during the Trump administration. But the but realize this whole movement against Mexican immigration is pretty long. This picture, for instance, is from 1917 in Nogales, Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora. And you'll notice there's no wall there. Well, in 1918, they built a wall um, because of a battle that happened there. So this picture is pretty emblematic of the transition between a borderless border region, a borderless frontier, to a bordered frontier, as in, eventually building a wall to keep these regions separated. Because this border between the U.S. and Mexico was basically completely open until 1918, with few exceptions. Now, the border itself came either from the Mexican American War or from the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. The Gadsden Purchase was partially because of filibusters. Now, filibusters are people who go across the border and try to take land for themselves. They are essentially private expeditions trying to conquer lands for themselves, often in the hopes that that newly conquered land would be annexed. There was actually a successful filibuster in Western Florida in 1810, which was annexed by the United States and is now called Baton Rouge. So filibusters hoped to basically recreate that, and they would do that throughout northern Mexico. The most successful of which was a guy named William Walker, who managed to take Baja California and Sonora in the 1850s. So this was a well, he didn't take Sonora. He was beaten back and ran across the border. Filibusters are kind of a joke, but they're also a very serious problem. In fact, there was a recent filibuster in oh crud, not Bolivia. It's northern, the northern part of South America, whatever that place is called. there was a filibuster like last year, of a bunch of private expeditionaries trying to take over a country. Venezuela. That's the name. It was an actual filibuster, an American filibuster. Not something you really see in the 21st century. Not even something you really see in the 20th century. It's a very 19th century thing. But that's one reason for keeping a border, is to keep, private expeditionaries from trying to take over Sonora. But there was also Apache raiding, and we'll get to the the Western wars, the Western Indian Wars. But Apaches would often use the sovereignty of the United States to as kind of a base and raid into northern Mexico for decades. Um, Comanches did this as well, but like Comanches were beaten throughout the 1860s, so we don't really need to talk about them. Um, but the U.S. ended up actually getting a treaty with Mexico that we were allowed to basically invade Mexico in order to stop these Apache raids. Um, Most notably, Geronimo in 1882 was stopped because of these treaties. Um, and mind you, northern Mexicans grew to really hate Apaches. I mean, they still have a deep hatred because of the sheer amount of killing Apaches engaged in. As part of this, and they basically use the U.S. as a home base. So you can see how this border's evolving, mostly from American aggression, surprisingly enough, or maybe unsurprisingly. The and then there's kind of a period of relative peace um there, except for the US started trying to stop Chinese people who were skirting the ban by going across the Mexican border, which was relatively unenforced. um and so in the early um in the early 20th century, these Chinese riders, as they were called, um, formed the basis of the Border Patrol. Um, I don't know what you're referring to there, Chase. Um, but the Chinese Border Patrol eventually morphed into the Border Patrol we have today, though that was um, that was actually created in 1918, but its predecessor are these Chinese riders. Um, and the first actual barrier between China between Mexico and the United States um, was a cattle barrier to stop a disease from actually going into Mexico. But it was erected by Californians. Um, it's called Texan cattle disease, I believe, is the name of the disease. But essentially, it was to stop cattle from going into Mexico and spreading the disease. But it's actually American cattle spreading the disease. So a little bit different. But the actual border wall begins in 1918 with right after a battle between this side of town and the American side of town, where there were literally people shooting across this border. Um, and in fact, there was a German officer found on this side. So it's also related to World War One, but it's partially because you have like Zapatistas and Vistas, these various revolutionaries who would get into shooting matches, and the U.S. was trying to stay neutral and stay out of it. But every once in a while, they'd end up fighting across the border, and then the U.S. has to get involved. And of course, the U.S. had secret dealings with like Pancho Villa for a little bit, supplying weapons and whatnot. We'll get to that in another class. But the Pancho Villa eventually raided into New Mexico, destroying the town of Columbus. If you know Columbus, that town was destroyed by Pancho Villa, killing several people there in the process, simply because we refused to give him arms anymore. And so then the United States invaded northern Mexico. That turned into a debacle. Then World War I happened. But in 1918, the Battle of Ambos Nogales, both Nogales is a border town. That's what's pictured here. Happened, and so the United States decided to start building a border wall. We've already talked about the literacy tests that were supposed to be enforced, but there were several other things, such as there was IDs and quotas. We've also talked about that. But these initial walls, this initial border wall, was mostly between border towns like Nogales. Or another example would be in California, where you have Calexico and uh, uh, Mexicali. That's the other one. Calexico and Mexicali were actually created by the same company, this agriculture company, but because they crossed the border in the Imperial Valley, they got split by a wall. Same thing with San Diego and Tijuana. These were early border walls, but basically to make immigration between the cities more regulated. But with these deportation programs that we've already talked about, and that there became more and more of an impetus to enforce the border more and more and more. And so, especially in the 1990s, with a huge amount of push right after the end of the Cold War, the Clinton administration passed a bill to pay for what was called the Tortilla Wall, which was essentially a wall for the entire border of California, breaking up it, blocking its border between Baja California and Sonora. And these oh, Chase, are you referring to Texas as a filibuster? Because there were Texan filibusters, but that's not a filibuster. Anyways, this tortilla wall was essentially the wall that we had all the way up until the Trump administration. There was a huge wall building effort by the Bush administration, but it was actually less than the Clinton administration, who had basically walled up the entire southern border of California. But there was a bit of building throughout Arizona and even in Texas, where they have a water border. That was actually a good chunk of the Bush administration's doing, because Bush was actually the governor of Texas beforehand. And then, of course, Trump campaigned for all of this to be extended. But really, what all of this has done is push illegal immigration out into the desert. And so from 1998 to 2018, the Border Patrol, and mind you, their estimates might be pretty low on this because it's in their favor to estimate it as fairly low, estimates that 7,500 people have died because of these border walls. Having to illegally immigrating through the desert and that. 7,500 over the course of 2 decades. So you could see that this wall that we I guess we're not doing anymore. This is a new administration. We'll see how that goes. Obama was very much a border enforcer, and considering Joe Biden was vice president, he might not be very different. We'll find out. But the Trump administration was very much about trying to build that border wall. And we can see that it has this long history, that it's not just about illegal immigration. It has to do with, raiding back and forth across the border, people actually having battles and whatnot. Like, that legacy is built into the wall itself. So um there we've been over a lot and we're running out of time. So, there's a lot of conflicts that remain from all of this. There's, of course, we've talked about nativism, which is essentially xenophobia, but on behalf of natives of that country, of this country, I should say. And it's often tied to other political problems. Remember that whole thing talking about like socialism and anarchism. A lot of the time, that kind of rhetoric against socialism and that is deeply, deeply racist. Um, and and it is built into this legacy of xenophobia. But there's also two competing ideas of America. There's this idea of the melting pot, where basically we synthesize a bunch of other cultures into our own, and there's various understandings of it. You have multiculturalism, where people kind of keep their cultures and it's just this large conglomerate of stuff. You have pluralism, where it's people are mixing, but not necessarily, they can do their own. There's cosmopolitanism, which is basically, thinking that the whole world is one culture and people coming together is natural. And then, of course, there's assimilation, which is, basically making people assimilate into that culture. Then that'll become a huge problem in the Western Indian Wars lecture. So we have that kind of stuff. There's also this idea of the crucible of liberty, which is basically the idea that like America is a new nation, and that these foreigners challenge that liberty, and so should be made to assimilate. You see how this melting pot metaphor can actually mean a lot of different things depending on its context. And that's how we generally see immigration today. And then you'll also hear today a lot of things such as we are a nation of immigrants. Now, we have always been more than 80% native throughout the entire history of the United States. It hit its the native population hit its lowest point in terms of percentage during this period, and it was 82%. So at no point were we a nation of immigrants. But the sentiment is that whole idea of a melting pot, that we have synthesized many immigrant cultures into our own throughout this entire period. That is the essential ideal when you hear somebody saying nation of immigrants, even though we never actually have been. The ideal is that melting pot. But you can see the melting pot metaphor can have many different meanings. And it's all this legacy of the quota system, of Chinese exclusion, of nativism, of the push and pull of immigration. That land of opportunity and land of refuge. So hopefully you guys can see, we don't have time to do much of a discussion today, but hopefully you guys can see that there is a huge legacy in all of this. I'm going to stop sharing. So we only have a couple of minutes, but any questions? This is always the awkward part of doing doing this. You can always hit the raise hand function or whatever if you're trying to type. I'll wait. Um, well, let's answer Chase's question. He was referring to, it feels like Texas was kind of like a filibuster, which there were actual filibusters in to Texas from 1810 to 1821. I mean, yeah, from 1810 and 1821, there were a series of filibusters, but what Chase was referring to was the Empresario program, which was actually legal immigration and was not an attempt to take over whatsoever. That's often a pretty bad misconception that a lot of people have about the Texas Revolution, that it was like pre-planned, and there's absolutely no evidence of that. Um, that it was very much reactive to the Santa Anna regime. Um, and we would talk a lot about that in the previous course in the first half, but no, it's not a filibuster. So any other questions? Cool. Well, I will let you guys go. It's 1:45, so have a great day. If you have any
Thank you.
questions, you can stick around or you can email me. I'll be having my office hours.